The night before the fall of the monarchy was thick with heat and foreboding. Clouds pressed low above the rooftops, muting the moonlight so that even the river seemed to crawl in silence. Paris felt like a lung that refused to exhale. In the narrow alleys of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, men moved with purpose but without words. Each corner hid the sound of grinding metal as knives were whetted on doorframes. The smell of oil, sweat, and smoke turned the air heavy. At the Tavern of the Three Pigeons, the benches were crowded with men who had been meeting in secret for days. They wore no uniforms, only coarse shirts rolled to the elbow, hands black with labor. One of them read aloud the latest decree from the assembly. The fatherland is in danger. The words were greeted not with cheers but with clenched jaws. The people no longer needed proclamations. They wanted reckoning. Outside, a woman sold cartridges wrapped in scraps of old newspapers. The ink bled against her fingers like blood. Farther west, the bells of Saint-Roch stood still, yet every man imagined hearing them. In the Hôtel de Ville, the room where the insurrectional commune gathered was lit by a single lantern. Its glass was cracked, and the flame shivered with every draft. Around the table sat men of the sections, pale from sleepless nights, ink-stained, eyes hollow. They had drawn up their final orders. The signal bell would ring before dawn. The people would march to the Tuileries. The king would be seized and judged. No one spoke of retreat. At the palace itself, candlelight glimmered behind shuttered windows. The Tuileries, once built for queens, now felt like a fortress waiting for siege. In the king's antechamber, muskets leaned against polished walls, and the marble floor echoed beneath the boots of the Swiss guards. They were foreign, disciplined, and doomed. Each man had cleaned his weapon twice, perhaps to still his hands. Their commander, Karl Joseph von Pfeffer, walked the corridors in silence, pausing before every doorway as if memorizing the place that would become his tomb. Marie Antoinette had not undressed. She stood at her window overlooking the garden, where the trees were black silhouettes against a restless sky. On her table lay letters to Austria, never sent. She thought of her brother, of soldiers who might even now be crossing the Rhine. Every creak of the floorboards seemed a footstep of the enemy, or of the people. When the clock struck midnight, she crossed herself and whispered in German, "If it must end, let it end swiftly." In another room, Louis XVI knelt before a crucifix, his heavy frame casting a long shadow on the wall. His chaplain murmured prayers that dissolved into the sound of distant thunder. The king's hands were clasped so tightly that the knuckles gleamed white. He believed still that heaven would not allow a crime against its anointed. Yet heaven had been silent for 3 years, and silence was beginning to sound like consent. Outside the palace gates, torches bobbed in the dark as the first crowds began to gather. They were not yet an army, more a swarm of restlessness, drawn by rumor and rage. Somewhere a drum began to beat, a slow pulse echoing across the Seine. From the Faubourg Saint-Marcel came answering drums, then from the Ile de la Cité, until the entire city seemed to throb with one rhythm. Dogs howled, windows slammed, mothers pulled their children close. At 2 in the morning, the tocsin of Saint-Roch finally broke the silence. Its first peal hung in the air, lonely and cold. Then another answered from Saint-Eustache, and then from Notre Dame, until Paris became a storm of bells. The sound rolled over the roofs and down into the river, echoing off the bridges. The uprising had begun. Men poured from every alley, torches flaring like veins of fire. They carried pikes, scythes, muskets, and kitchen knives bound to sticks. Some wore the red cap of liberty. Others wrapped tricolor scarves around their arms. Women followed with buckets of water and sacks of stones. Children dragged empty powder barrels, laughing, not yet understanding what game was being played. In the square before the Hôtel de Ville, the leaders of the new commune climbed the steps to address the crowd. Their words were swallowed by the roar, but the meaning was clear enough. The king was a traitor, the palace a nest of conspirators, and the dawn would bring justice. The drums beat faster. The air stank of sweat and pitch. In the distance, the first pale thread of light touched the eastern sky. Inside the Tuileries, the guards heard the bells and tightened their ranks. They loaded cartridges in silence, each movement crisp and rehearsed. The king's ministers argued in whispers. The queen demanded that the defenders fire if attacked. The king shook his head. "I will not be the cause of Frenchmen killing Frenchmen," he said, as if his refusal could stop the tide outside. By 3 o'clock, the streets leading to the palace were filled with a moving forest of spears and banners. From the Pont Neuf came the volunteers from Marseille, their boots splashing through puddles, their faces dark with soot. They hauled cannon by rope and sang as they came, the new war song that had become the anthem of defiance. Its refrain rose above the drums like a prayer turned to steel. The citizens along the quays watched from their windows, some cheering, some weeping. One old woman crossed herself and muttered that the angels were fleeing the city. In the gardens of the Louvre, pigeons rose in frightened flocks. The light of torches painted the river red. By the time the clock struck 4, the revolution's heartbeat had quickened beyond return. The leaders of the sections met one last time at the Hôtel de Ville. Maps lay spread across the table, ink smudged by trembling hands. The plan was simple. Columns from the east, the south, and the center would converge on the palace at dawn. Cannon would be placed at the bridges. Messengers would carry news to the assembly. If the king surrendered, he would be taken alive. If he resisted, Paris would burn him out. At the Tuileries, the queen ordered her attendants to wake the Dauphin. The boy cried at the noise, clutching his toy drum. She held him close, whispering, "Be brave, my son. You were born a king." Her voice cracked on the last word. The first light of morning crept across the palace gardens, pale and sickly. Dew glistened on the leaves like sweat. The statues of old monarchs watched from their pedestals, faces eroded by time, as if they knew their line was ending. The air trembled with the sound of footsteps approaching from every direction, and then the bell of the Hôtel de Ville struck again, deeper this time, slow and deliberate. One stroke for each promise the revolution had made, and not yet kept. The echo rolled across the Seine and reached the palace walls. The Swiss guards looked to their commander. He said nothing. They knew the hour had come. Outside the gates, the crowd began to chant. Not words, but a rhythm. The same rhythm that had haunted the city all night. It grew louder, fused with the pounding of drums, until even the birds fled from the trees. The day of judgment was coming with the sun. Dawn arrived not with light, but with a gray pall, a sky heavy as stone. The air tasted of metal, thick with the breath of thousands. From every quarter of Paris came the sound of feet against cobblestone, the scrape of wheels dragging cannon, the hiss of torches dying in the damp. The Seine ran sluggish and dark beside them, a mirror to the march. The first columns reached the Carousel Square at 7 o'clock. The broad space before the palace filled like a basin, overflowing with men, women, and children. Some held banners inked with the words, "Liberté," and more. Others carried nothing but fury. From the east came the men of Saint-Antoine, from the south the Saint-Marcel workers, and from the north the Marseillais volunteers. Their song, hoarse from the march, rolled through the mist. It was no longer melody, but a chant, a drum made of lungs. The palace stood before them in silence. Its windows were shuttered, its gardens immaculate. Behind the gates, the Swiss guards waited, statues in red cloth, bayonets fixed. They had been ordered to defend the royal family, without weakness. Their officers watched the crowd through the iron bars and could feel the heat of its breath. A single wrong motion, and the world would tilt. Inside, the courtiers clustered in the marble halls like ghosts refusing to vanish. The king moved among them, calm to the point of vacancy. He stopped once to speak to an officer of the National Guard, asking whether the people would truly dare to attack. The man did not answer. At 8, a delegation of insurgents demanded entry to read a petition. Louis received them, his voice measured but hollow. He promised reform, trust, reconciliation. No one listened. The crowd outside swayed like the tide. Then, from somewhere beyond the square, a musket fired, one single crack that tore the morning open. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then everything broke. Gunfire rippled along the line of guards, answered by a roar from the crowd. Smoke billowed across the square, turning daylight to dusk. The first cannon spoke, its echo smashing against the palace walls. Windows shattered, statues splintered. The smell of powder and blood fused in the air. The Swiss fired in disciplined volleys, cutting down the first ranks, but the tide did not retreat. The dead were trampled where they fell. Men clambered over the gates, others hacked at them with axes. Drums beat faster, drowning out the screams. From the gardens came the thunder of musketry, the sharp cries of the wounded, the clatter of falling arms. Women poured water into buckets for the cannon crews, their faces streaked with soot. Inside the palace, chaos spread like fire. Courtiers ran through corridors clutching rosaries. The queen stood in the council chamber, white-faced, holding her son. "We are lost," she whispered. The king said nothing. His silence was worse than panic. It was the silence of a man already erased. The National Guard commander, Mandat, tried to negotiate a ceasefire, but he was seized by the Commune and executed on the steps of the Hôtel de Ville. His blood had barely cooled before news reached the Tuileries. There would be no truce. The Swiss held their ground for 2 hours. They fired from the windows, from the staircases, from the gallery of mirrors where courtiers had once danced. Smoke filled the halls. Chandeliers melted and dripped wax like tears. The insurgents, furious and half-blind, stormed the lower floors, bayonets flashing in the dim light. Each room became a furnace of noise and death. At 10, a messenger arrived bearing an order, supposedly from the king, commanding the Swiss to cease fire and withdraw to the assembly. Pfiffer hesitated, then obeyed. He gathered his men and led them out through the gardens. The crowd saw the movement and mistook it for counterattack. Muskets flared. The disciplined line dissolved under a storm of lead. The air filled with shouts in French and German, pleas for mercy, the guttural cries of men dying with muskets still in hand. Those trapped inside the palace were slaughtered where they stood. Blood pooled on the marble floors, mixing with wine from shattered casks. Some guards threw down their arms and begged in broken French. They were struck down anyway. The insurgents were beyond speech, beyond pity. Every blow seemed to avenge a lifetime of hunger. By noon, the Tuileries was no longer a palace, but a carcass. Curtains smoldered, mirrors shattered. Smoke drifted through open doors, carrying the smell of charred wood and human fat. The great staircases were slick with blood. The throne room stood empty except for a broken scepter and a single shoe left behind in the queen's flight. In the gardens, the bodies of the Swiss were piled beside the fountains. Some were stripped of their red coats. Children dipped cloth in their blood as trophies. Women cut the lace from their cuffs to sell in the markets. The statues of kings watched without eyes as the revolution crowned itself in ruin. Back in the assembly, the king sat pale and silent while deputies shouted over the news. The ceiling trembled with each cannon blast. When word came that the fighting had ceased, Louis crossed himself and whispered, "May God forgive them." No one answered. Outside, the crowd demanded his head. The royal family was led under guard to the convent of the Feuillants. They passed through streets littered with broken weapons and the wreckage of carriages. The people watched in silence. Some spat, others simply stared, as if watching an eclipse. The king looked neither left nor right. The queen clutched her children, her dress stained with ash. Behind them, the palace burned. The flames reached the sky, painting the clouds orange. The smoke rolled eastward, blotting out the sun. From the bridges, Parisians watched the fire and sang the Marseillaise, their voices hoarse but exultant. The monarchy had fallen, and in its ashes something new, uncertain, and terrible was being born. By evening, the smoke hung low over Paris, thick as fog, veiling the rooftops in a dull crimson glow. The Tuileries smoldered like a dying furnace. From the bridges, the river reflected the fire, its surface rippling with streaks of gold and ash. The air stank of salt, powder, and something sourer, the faint metallic scent that only follows great violence. The streets near the palace were silent except for the crunch of glass underfoot. Men moved through the ruins carrying lanterns, their light trembling across heaps of broken furniture, torn banners, and bodies. The Swiss lay where they had fallen, their red coats darkened to black. Some still clutched their weapons, others had been stripped, their faces turned to the sky. The fountains, once fed by hidden pipes of silver, now ran thick with diluted blood. In the Place du Carrousel, Groups of sans-culottes huddled around small fires, speaking in low voices. They had won, yet victory felt strange, too heavy, too quiet. A few raised cups of watered wine and toasted La Liberté. Others simply stared at their hands as if expecting them still to shake. The daylight faded behind the smoke until the world turned gray. Inside the Legislative Assembly, candles burned down to stumps. Deputies argued through exhaustion. Some demanded that the king be put on trial. Others murmured that the revolution had gone far enough. The smell of sweat and wax filled the chamber. Louis sat apart, surrounded by guards, his expression emptied of thought. He looked less like a prisoner than a man already halfway to the grave. When told that the monarchy had been suspended, he bowed his head once, saying only, "I forgive." At the convent of the Feuillants, the queen held her children through the night. From the cloister windows came the sound of bells tolling in celebration. Each peal struck like an accusation. She listened until dawn, her face turned toward the wall, whispering names of cities: Vienna, Brussels, Prague, as if each might still come to her rescue. None did. Back at the Tuileries, scavengers moved among the ruins. Women searched for silk and jewelry. Boys pried bullets from the walls to sell for scrap. In the king's chamber, the great canopy bed was torn to rags. In the queen's room, a mirror lay cracked in 4 pieces, each reflecting a different shard of flame. The air was still hot enough to shimmer. When the sun broke over the city, the smoke turned gold for a moment, a cruel parody of dawn. By midday, the carts arrived for the dead. They rolled slowly through the courtyards, wooden wheels creaking over stone. A few priests followed, their vestments gray with ash. The bodies were lifted with care or haste, depending on who watched. The smell of lime rose as they were buried in shallow pits near the Seine. Over each trench, someone placed a branch of laurel, a strange gesture of respect for men who had died defending a crown the world no longer wanted. In the markets that afternoon, vendors told the story differently. Some said the king himself had ordered the Swiss to fire. Others swore he had wept and forbidden it. Rumor became history before the day was done. Children played in the gutters, chanting fragments of the Marseillaise. Every echo of that song felt like the heartbeat of a new, uncertain republic. That evening, as the last fires guttered out, a storm broke over the city. Rain fell in sudden torrents, hissing as it struck the still warm stones. The water ran red through the drains, carrying away the ash. The thunder drowned the cheers, and for a brief moment Paris was silent again. Washed clean but not absolved. Far away, in the camps of the Austrian and Prussian armies, officers would soon hear of the uprising and smile grimly. They believed the revolution was devouring itself. They did not yet understand that what had died at the Tuileries was not a regime, but the idea of obedience itself. When night came, a thin mist rose from the river. The palace stood dark, its windows gaping, its gardens strewn with debris. A stray cat moved across the courtyard, where kings had once walked. The moon shone faintly through the smoke, silvering the puddles where blood and rain had mixed. Somewhere a watchman struck his staff against the stones, counting the hours of a city that no longer recognized them. The people had won their freedom, or perhaps only a new chain forged by their own hands. The future waited in silence, unseen, like a blade beneath cloth. And above the hushed city, the bells began again, slow and solemn, tolling for the death of a kingdom and the birth of something far more dangerous, a people who had learned that thrones can burn.